Patriotism on the 28th of February, 1936. On the third day, that is, of the February 26th incident, Lieutenant Shinji Takayama of the Kono Transport Battalion, profoundly disturbed by the knowledge that his closest colleagues had been with the mutineers from the beginning, and indignant at the imminent prospect of Imperial troops attacking Imperial troops, took his officer's sword and ceremonially disemboweled himself in the 8th room of his private residence in the 6th block of Aobercho, in Yotsuya Ward. His wife, Raiko, followed him, stabbing herself to death. The lieutenant's farewell note consisted of one sentence: "Long live the Imperial forces." His wife's, after apologies for her unfilial conduct in thus preceding her parents to the grave, concluded, "The day which, for a soldier's wife, had to come, has come." The last moments of this heroic and dedicated couple were such as to make the gods themselves weep. The lieutenant's age, it should be noted, was 31, his wife's 23, and it was not half a year since the celebration of their marriage. Those who saw the bride and bridegroom in the commemorative photograph, perhaps no less than those actually present at the lieutenant's wedding, had exclaimed in wonder at the bearing of this handsome couple. The lieutenant, majestic in military uniform, stood protectively beside his bride, his right hand resting upon his sword, his officer's cap held at his left side. His expression was severe, and his dark brows and wide-gazing eyes well conveyed the clear integrity of youth. For the beauty of the bride in her white overrobe no comparisons were adequate. In the eyes, round beneath soft brows, in the slender, finely shaped nose, and in the full lips, there was both sensuousness and refinement. One hand, emerging shyly from a sleeve of the overrobe, held a fan, and the tips of the fingers, clustering delicately, were like the bud of a moonflower. After the suicide, people would take out this photograph and examine it, and sadly reflect that too often there was a curse on these seemingly flawless unions. Perhaps it was no more than imagination, but looking at the picture after the tragedy it almost seemed as if the two young people before the gold-lacquered screen were gazing, each with equal clarity, at the deaths which lay before them. Thanks to the good offices of their go-between, Lieutenant General Ozaki, they had been able to set themselves up in a new home at Aobercho in Yotsuya. New home is perhaps misleading. It was an old 3-room rented house backing onto a small garden, as neither the 6 nor the 4.5 room downstairs was favored by the sun. They used the upstairs 8 room as both bedroom and guest room. There was no maid, so Raiko was left alone to guard the house in her husband's absence. The honeymoon trip was dispensed with on the grounds that these were times of national emergency. The two of them had spent the first night of their marriage at this house. Before going to bed, Shinji, sitting erect on the floor with his sword laid before him, had bestowed upon his wife a soldierly lecture. A woman who had become the wife of a soldier should know and resolutely accept that her husband's death might come at any moment. It could be tomorrow, it could be the day after, but, no matter when it came, he asked, was she steadfast in her resolve to accept it? Raiko rose to her feet, pulled open a drawer of the cabinet, and took out what was the most prized of her new possessions, the dagger her mother had given her. Returning to her place, she laid the dagger without a word on the mat before her, just as her husband had laid his sword. A silent understanding was achieved at once, and the lieutenant never again sought to test his wife's resolve. In the first few months of her marriage, Raiko's beauty grew daily more radiant, shining serene like the moon after rain. As both were possessed of young, vigorous bodies, their relationship was passionate. Nor was this merely a matter of the night. On more than one occasion, returning home straight from maneuvers, and begrudging even the time it took to remove his mud-splashed uniform, the lieutenant had pushed his wife to the floor almost as soon as he had entered the house. Raiko was equally ardent in her response. For a little more or a little less than a month, from the first night of their marriage, Raiko knew happiness, and the lieutenant, seeing this, was happy too. Raiko's body was white and pure, and her swelling breasts conveyed a firm and chaste refusal, but, upon consent, those breasts were lavish with their intimate, welcoming warmth. Even in bed these two were frighteningly and awesomely serious. In the very midst of wild, intoxicating passions, their hearts were sober and serious. By day the lieutenant would think of his wife in the brief rest periods between training, and all day long, at home, Raiko would recall the image of her husband. Even when apart, however, they had only to look at the wedding photograph for their happiness to be once more confirmed. Raiko felt not the slightest surprise that a man who had been a complete stranger until a few months ago should now have become the sun about which her whole world revolved. All these things had a moral basis, and were in accordance with the education rescript's injunction that husband and wife should be harmonious. Not once did Raiko contradict her husband, nor did the lieutenant ever find reason to scold his wife. On the god shelf below the stairway, alongside the tablet from the Great Eyes Shrine, were set photographs of their imperial majesties, and regularly every morning, before leaving for duty, the lieutenant would stand with his wife at this hallowed place and together they would bow their heads low. The offering water was renewed each morning, and the sacred sprig of Sasaki was always green and fresh. Their lives were lived beneath the solemn protection of the gods and were filled with an intense happiness which set every fiber in their bodies trembling. Although Lord Privy Seal Sato's house was in their neighborhood, neither of them heard any noise of gunfire on the morning of February 26th. It was a bugle, sounding muster in the dim, snowy dawn, when the 10-minute tragedy had already ended, which first disrupted the lieutenant's slumbers. Leaping at once from his bed, and without speaking a word, the lieutenant donned his uniform, buckled on the sword held ready for him by his wife, and hurried swiftly out into the snow-covered streets of the still darkened morning. He did not return until the evening of the 28th. Later, from the radio news, Raiko learned the full extent of this sudden eruption of violence. Her life throughout the subsequent 2 days was lived alone in complete tranquility and behind locked doors. In the lieutenant's face, as he hurried silently out into the snowy morning, Raiko had read the determination to die. If her husband did not return, her own decision was made. She too would die. Quietly she attended to the disposition of her personal possessions. She chose her sets of visiting kimonos as keepsakes for friends of her school days, and she wrote a name and address on the stiff paper wrapping in which each was folded. Constantly admonished by her husband never to think of the morrow, Raiko had not even kept a diary and was now denied the pleasure of assiduously rereading her record of the happiness of the past few months and consigning each page to the fire as she did so. Ranged across the top of the radio were a small china dog, a rabbit, a squirrel, a bear, and a fox. There were also a small vase and a water pitcher. These comprised Raiko's one and only collection, but it would hardly do, she imagined, to give such things as keepsakes, nor again would it be quite proper to ask specifically for them to be included in the coffin. It seemed to Raiko, as these thoughts passed through her mind, that the expressions on the small animals' faces grew even more lost and forlorn. Raiko took the squirrel in her hand and looked at it, and then, her thoughts turning to a realm far beyond these childlike affections, she gazed up into the distance at the great sun-like principle which her husband embodied. She was ready, and happy, to be hurtled along to her destruction in that gleaming sun chariot. But now, for these few moments of solitude, she allowed herself to luxuriate in this innocent attachment to trifles. The time when she had genuinely loved these things, however, was long past. Now she merely loved the memory of having once loved them, and their place in her heart had been filled by more intense passions, by a more frenzied happiness, for Raiko had never, even to herself, thought of those soaring joys of the flesh as a mere pleasure. The February cold, and the icy touch of the china squirrel, had numbed Raiko's slender fingers. Yet, even so, in her lower limbs, beneath the ordered repetition of the pattern which crossed the skirt of her trim misan kimono, she could feel now, as she thought of the lieutenant's powerful arms reaching out toward her, a hot moistness of the flesh which defied the snows. She was not in the least afraid of the death hovering in her mind. Waiting alone at home, Raiko firmly believed that everything her husband was feeling or thinking now, his anguish and distress, was leading her, just as surely as the power in his flesh, to a welcome death. She felt as if her body could melt away with ease and be transformed to the merest fraction of her husband's thought. Listening to the frequent announcements on the radio, she heard the names of several of her husband's colleagues mentioned among those of the insurgents. This was news of death. She followed the developments closely, wondering anxiously, as the situation became daily more irrevocable, why no imperial ordnance was sent down, and watching what had at first been taken as a movement to restore the nation's honor come gradually to be branded with the infamous name of mutiny. There was no communication from the regiment. At any moment, it seemed, fighting might commence in the city streets, where the remains of the snow still lay. Toward sundown on the 28th, Raiko was startled by a furious pounding on the front door. She hurried downstairs. As she pulled with fumbling fingers at the bolt, the shape dimly outlined beyond the frosted glass panel made no sound, but she knew it was her husband. Raiko had never known the bolt on the sliding door to be so stiff. Still it resisted. The door just would not open. In a moment, almost before she knew she had succeeded, the lieutenant was standing before her on the cement floor inside the porch, muffled in a khaki greatcoat, his top boots heavy with slush from the street. Closing the door behind him, he returned the bolt once more to its socket. With what significance, Raiko did not understand. "Welcome home," Raiko bowed deeply, but her husband made no response, as he had already unfastened his sword and was about to remove his greatcoat. Raiko moved around behind to assist. The coat, which was cold and damp and had lost the odor of horse dung it normally exuded when exposed to the sun, weighed heavily upon her arm. Draping it across a hanger, and cradling the sword and leather belt in her sleeves, she waited while her husband removed his top boots and then followed behind him into the living room. This was the six-mat room downstairs, seen in the clear light from the lamp. Her husband's face, covered with a heavy growth of bristle, was almost unrecognizably wasted and thin. The cheeks were hollow, their luster and resilience gone. In his normal good spirits he would have changed into old clothes as soon as he was home and have pressed her to get supper at once. But now he sat before the table still in his uniform, his head drooping dejectedly. Raiko refrained from asking whether she should prepare the supper. After an interval the lieutenant spoke. I knew nothing. They hadn't asked me to join, perhaps out of consideration, because I was newly married. Kano, and Homa too, and Yamaguchi. Raiko recalled momentarily the faces of high-spirited young officers, friends of her husband, who had come to the house occasionally as guests. There may be an Imperial ordnance sent down tomorrow. They'll be posted as rebels, I imagine. I shall be in command of a unit with orders to attack them. I can't do it. It's impossible to do a thing like that. He spoke again. They've taken me off guard duty, and I have permission to return home for one night. Tomorrow morning, without question, I must leave to join the attack. I can't do it, Raiko. Raiko sat erect with lowered eyes. She understood clearly that her husband had spoken of his death. The lieutenant was resolved. Each word, being rooted in death, emerged sharply and with powerful significance against this dark, unmovable background. Although the lieutenant was speaking of his dilemma, already there was no room in his mind for vacillation. However, there was a clarity, like the clarity of a stream fed from melting snows, in the silence which rested between them. Sitting in his own home after the long two-day ordeal, and looking across at the face of his beautiful wife, the lieutenant was for the first time experiencing true peace of mind, for he had at once known, though she said nothing, that his wife divined the resolve which lay beneath his words. Well, then, the lieutenant's eyes opened wide. Despite this exhaustion they were strong and clear, and now for the first time they looked straight into the eyes of his wife. Tonight I shall cut my stomach. Raiko did not flinch. Her round eyes showed tension, as taut as the clang of a bell. I am ready, she said. I ask permission to accompany you. The lieutenant felt almost mesmerized by the strength in those eyes. His words flowed swiftly and easily, like the utterances of a man in delirium, and it was beyond his understanding how permission in a matter of such weight could be expressed so casually. Good, we'll go together, but I want you as a witness, first, for my own suicide. Agreed. When this was said, a sudden release of abundant happiness welled up in both their hearts. Raiko was deeply affected by the greatness of her husband's trust in her. It was vital for the lieutenant, whatever else might happen, that there should be no irregularity in his death. For that reason there had to be a witness. The fact that he had chosen his wife for this was the first mark of his trust. The second, and even greater mark, was that though he had pledged that they should die together, he did not intend to kill his wife first. He had deferred her death to a time when he would no longer be there to verify it. If the lieutenant had been a suspicious husband, he would doubtless, as in the usual suicide pact, have chosen to kill his wife first. When Raiko said, I ask permission to accompany you, the lieutenant felt these words to be the final fruit of the education which he had himself given his wife, starting on the first night of their marriage, and which had schooled her, when the moment came, to say what had to be said without a shadow of hesitation. This flattered the lieutenant's opinion of himself as a self-reliant man. He was not so romantic or conceited as to imagine that the words were spoken spontaneously, out of love for her husband. With happiness welling almost too abundantly in their hearts, they could not help smiling at each other. Raiko felt as if she had returned to her wedding night. Before her eyes was neither pain nor death. She seemed to see only a free and limitless expanse opening out into vast distances. The water is hot. Will you take your bath now? Ah yes, of course. And supper. The words were delivered in such level, domestic tones that the lieutenant came near to thinking, for the fraction of a second, that everything had been a hallucination. I don't think we'll need supper, but perhaps you could warm some sake, as you wish. As Raiko rose and took a tanzan gown from the cabinet for after the bath, she purposely directed her husband's attention to the open drawer. The lieutenant rose, crossed to the cabinet, and looked inside. From the ordered array of paper wrappings he read, one by one, the addresses on the keepsakes. There was no grief in the lieutenant's response to this demonstration of heroic resolve. His heart was filled with tenderness, like a husband who is proudly shown the childish purchases of a young wife. The lieutenant, overwhelmed by affection, lovingly embraced his wife from behind and implanted a kiss upon her neck. Raiko felt the roughness of the lieutenant's unshaven skin against her neck. This sensation, more than being just a thing of this world, was for Raiko almost a world itself. But now, with the feeling that it was soon to be lost forever, it had freshness beyond her experience. Each moment had its own vital strength, and the senses in every corner of her body were reawakened. Accepting her husband's caresses from behind, Raiko raised herself on the tips of her toes, letting the vitality seep through her entire body. First the bath, and then, after some sake, lay out the bedding upstairs. "Will you?" The lieutenant whispered the words into his wife's ear. Raiko silently nodded. Flinging off his uniform, the lieutenant went to the bath. To faint background noises of slopping water, Raiko tended the charcoal brazier in the living room and began the preparations for warming the sake. Taking the tamsin, a sash, and some underclothes, she went to the bathroom to ask how the water was. In the midst of a coiling cloud of steam, the lieutenant was sitting cross-legged on the floor, shaving, and she could dimly discern the rippling movements of the muscles on his damp, powerful back as they responded to the movement of his arms. There was nothing to suggest a time of any special significance. Raiko, going busily about her tasks, was preparing side dishes from odds and ends in stock. Her hands did not tremble. If anything, she managed even more efficiently and smoothly than usual. From time to time, it is true, there was a strange throbbing deep within her breast, like distant lightning. It had a moment of sharp intensity and then vanished without trace. Apart from that, nothing was in any way out of the ordinary. The lieutenant, shaving in the bathroom, felt his warm body miraculously healed at last of the desperate tiredness of the days of indecision and filled, in spite of the death which lay ahead, with pleasurable anticipation. The sound of his wife going about her work came to him faintly. A healthy physical craving, submerged for 2 days, reasserted itself. The lieutenant was confident there had been no impurity in the joy they had experienced when resolving upon death. They had both sensed at that moment, though not, of course, in any clear and conscious way, that those permissible pleasures which they shared in private were once more beneath the protection of righteousness and divine power, and of a complete and unassailable morality. On looking into each other's eyes and discovering their honorable death, they had felt themselves safe once more behind steel walls which none could destroy, encased in an impenetrable armor of beauty and truth. Thus, so far from seeing any inconsistency or conflict between the urges of his flesh and the sincerity of his patriotism, the lieutenant was even able to regard the two as parts of the same thing. Thrusting his face close to the dark, cracked, misted wall mirror, the lieutenant shaped himself with great care. This would be his death face. There must be no unsightly blemishes. The clean-shaven face gleamed once more with a youthful luster, seeming to brighten the darkness of the mirror. There was a certain elegance, he even felt, in the association of death with this radiantly healthy face. Just as it looked now, this would become his death face, already. In fact, it had half departed from the lieutenant's personal possession and had become the bust above a dead soldier's memorial. As an experiment, he closed his eyes tight. Everything was wrapped in blackness, and he was no longer a living, seeing creature. Returning from the bath, the traces of the shape glowing faintly blue beneath his smooth cheeks, he seated himself beside the now well-kindled charcoal brazier. Busy though Raiko was, he noticed, she had found time lightly to touch up her face. Her cheeks were gay and her lips moist. There was no shadow of sadness to be seen. Truly, the lieutenant felt, as he saw this mark of his young wife's passionate nature, he had chosen the wife he ought to have chosen. As soon as the lieutenant had drained his sake cup, he offered it to Raiko. Raiko had never before tasted sake, but she accepted without hesitation and sipped timidly. "Come here," the lieutenant said. Raiko moved to her husband's side and was embraced as she leaned backward across his lap. Her breast was in violent commotion, as if sadness, joy, and the potent sake were mingling and reacting within her. The lieutenant looked down into his wife's face. It was the last face he would see in this world, the last face he would see of his wife. The lieutenant scrutinized the face minutely, with the eyes of a traveler bidding farewell to splendid vistas which he will never revisit. It was a face he could not tire of looking at, the features regular yet not cold, the lips slightly closed with a soft strength. The lieutenant kissed those lips, unthinkingly, and suddenly, though there was not the slightest distortion of the face into the unsightliness of sobbing, he noticed that tears were welling slowly from beneath the long lashes of the closed eyes and brimming over into a glistening stream. When, a little later, the lieutenant urged that they should move to the upstairs bedroom, his wife replied that she would follow after taking a bath. Climbing the stairs alone to the bedroom, where the air was already warmed by the gas heater, the lieutenant lay down on the bedding with arms outstretched and legs apart. Even the time at which he lay waiting for his wife to join him was no later and no earlier than usual. He folded his hands beneath his head and gazed at the dark boards of the ceiling in the dimness beyond the range of the standard lamp. Was it death he was now waiting for, or a wild ecstasy of the senses? The two seemed to overlap, almost as if the object of this bodily desire was death itself. But, however that might be, it was certain that never before had the lieutenant tasted such total freedom. There was the sound of a car outside the window. He could hear the screech of its tires skidding in the snow piled at the side of the street. The sound of its horn re-echoed from nearby walls. Listening to these noises, he had the feeling that this house rose like a solitary island in the ocean of a society going as restlessly about its business as ever. All around, vastly and untidily, stretched the country for which he grieved. He was to give his life for it, but would that great county, with which he was prepared to remonstrate to the extent of destroying himself, take the slightest heed of his death? He did not know, and not matter. His was a battlefield without glory, a battlefield where none could display deeds of valor. It was the front line of the spirit. Raiko's footsteps sounded on the stairway. The steep stairs in this old house creaked badly. There were fond memories in that creaking, and many a time, while waiting in bed, the lieutenant had listened to its welcome sound. At the thought that he would hear it no more, he listened with intense concentration, striving for every corner of every moment of this precious time to be filled with the sound of those soft footfalls on the creaking stairway. The moment seemed transformed to jewels, sparkling with inner light. Raiko wore a Nagoya sash about the waist of her yukata, but as the lieutenant reached toward it, its redness sobered by the dimness of the light. Raiko's hand moved to his assistance and the sash fell away, slithering swiftly to the floor. As she stood before him, still in her yukata, the lieutenant inserted his hands through the side slits beneath each sleeve, intending to embrace her as she was, but at the touch of his fingertips upon the warm naked flesh, and as the armpits closed gently about his hands, his whole body was suddenly aflame. In a few moments the two lay naked before the glowing gas heater. Neither spoke the thought, but their hearts, their bodies, and their pounding breasts blazed with the knowledge that this was the very last time. It was as if the words "the last time" were spelled out, in invisible brush strokes, across every inch of their bodies. The lieutenant drew his wife close and kissed her vehemently, as their tongues explored each other's mouths, reaching out into the smooth, moist interior. They felt as if the still unknown agonies of death had tempered their senses to the keenness of red-hot steel. The agonies they could not yet feel, the distant pains of death, had refined their awareness of pleasure. "This is the last time I shall see your body," said the lieutenant. "Let me look at it closely," and, tilting the shade on the lampstand to one side, he directed the rays along the full length of Raiko's outstretched form. Raiko lay still with her eyes closed. The light from the low lamp clearly revealed the majestic sweep of her white flesh. The lieutenant, not without a touch of egocentricity, rejoiced that he would never see this beauty crumble in death. At his leisure, the lieutenant allowed the unforgettable spectacle to engrave itself upon his mind. With one hand he fondled the hair, with the other he softly stroked the magnificent face, implanting kisses here and there where his eyes lingered. The quiet coldness of the high, tapering forehead, the closed eyes with their long lashes beneath faintly etched brows, the set of the finely shaped nose, the gleam of teeth glimpsed between full, regular lips, the soft cheeks and the small, wise chin, these things conjured up in the lieutenant's mind the vision of a truly radiant death face, and again he pressed his lips tight against the white throat where Raiko's own hand was soon to strike, and the throat reddened faintly beneath his kisses. Returning to the mouth, he laid his lips against it with the gentlest of pressures, and moved them rhythmically over Raiko's with the light rolling motion of a small boat. If he closed his eyes, the world became a rocking cradle. Wherever the lieutenant's eyes moved, his lips faithfully followed. The high, swelling breasts, surmounted by nipples like the buds of a wild cherry, hardened as the lieutenant's lips closed about them. The arms flowed smoothly downward from each side of the breast, tapering toward the wrists, yet losing nothing of their roundness or symmetry, and at their tips were those delicate fingers which had held the fan at the wedding ceremony. One by one, as the lieutenant kissed them, the fingers withdrew behind their neighbor as if in shame. The natural hollow curving between the bosom and the stomach carried in its lines a suggestion not only of softness but of resilient strength, and while it gave forewarning of the rich curves spreading outward from here to the hips, it had, in itself, an appearance only of restraint and proper discipline. The whiteness and richness of the stomach and hips was like milk brimming in a great bowl, and the sharply SHA type of the navel could have been the fresh impress of a raindrop, fallen there that very moment, where the shadows gathered more thickly, hair clustered, gentle and sensitive, and as the agitation mounted in the now no longer passive body there hung over this region a scent like the smoldering of fragrant blossoms, growing steadily more pervasive. At length, in a tremulous voice, Raiko spoke. "Show me, let me look too." For the last time, never before had he heard from his wife's lips so strong and unequivocal a request. It was as if something which her modesty had wished to keep hidden to the end had suddenly burst its bonds of constraint. The lieutenant obediently lay back and surrendered himself to his wife. Lightly she raised her white, trembling body, and, burning with an innocent desire to return to her husband what he had done for her, placed 2 white fingers on the lieutenant's eyes, which gazed fixedly up at her, and gently stroked them shut. Suddenly overwhelmed by tenderness, her cheeks flushed by a dizzying uprush of emotion, Raiko threw her arms about the lieutenant's close-cropped head. The bristly hairs rubbed painfully against her breast. The prominent nose was cold as it dug into her flesh, and his breath was hot. Relaxing her embrace, she gazed down at her husband's masculine face, the severe brows, the closed eyes, the splendid bridge of the nose, the shapely lips drawn firmly together, the blue, clean-shaven cheeks reflecting the light and gleaming smoothly. Raiko kissed each of these. She kissed the broad nape of the neck, the strong, erect shoulders, the powerful chest with its twin circles like shields and its russet nipples, in the armpits, deeply shadowed by the ample flesh of the shoulders and chest. A sweet and melancholy odor emanated from the growth of hair, and in the sweetness of this odor was contained, somehow, the essence of young death. The lieutenant's naked skin glowed like a field of barley, and everywhere the muscles showed in sharp relief, converging on the lower abdomen about the small, unassuming navel. Gazing at the youthful, firm stomach, modestly covered by a vigorous growth of hair, Raiko thought of it as it was soon to be, cruelly cut by the sword, and she laid her head upon it, sobbing in pity, and bathed it with kisses. At the touch of his wife's tears upon his stomach the lieutenant felt ready to endure with courage the cruelest agonies of his suicide. What ecstasies they experienced after these tender exchanges may well be imagined. The lieutenant raised himself and enfolded his wife in a powerful embrace, her body now limp with exhaustion after her grief and tears. Passionately they held their faces close, rubbing cheek against cheek. Raiko's body was trembling, their breasts, moist with sweat, were tightly joined, and every inch of the young and beautiful bodies had become so much one with the other that it seemed impossible there should ever again be a separation. Raiko cried out. From the heights they plunged into the abyss, and from the abyss they took wing and soared once more to dizzying heights. The lieutenant panted like the regimental standard-bearer on a route march. As one cycle ended, almost immediately a new wave of passion would be generated, and together, with no trace of fatigue, they would climb again in a single breathless movement to the very summit. When the lieutenant at last turned away, it was not from weariness. For one thing, he was anxious not to undermine the considerable strength he would need in carrying out his suicide. For another, he would have been sorry to mar the sweetness of these last memories by overindulgence. Since the lieutenant had clearly desisted, Raiko too with her usual compliance followed his example. The two lay on their backs, with fingers interlaced, staring fixedly at the dark ceiling. The room was warm from the heater, and even when the sweat had ceased to pour from their bodies they felt no cold. Outside, in the hushed night, the sounds of passing traffic had ceased. Even the noises of the trains and streetcars around Yotsuya Station did not penetrate this far. After echoing through the region bounded by the moat, they were lost in the heavily wooded park fronting the broad driveway before Akasaka Palace. It was hard to believe in the tension gripping this whole quarter, where the two factions of the bitterly divided imperial army now confronted each other, poised for battle. Savoring the warmth glowing within themselves, they lay still and recalled the ecstasies they had just known. Each moment of the experience was relived. They remembered the taste of kisses which had never wearied, the touch of naked flesh, episode after episode of dizzying bliss. But already, from the dark boards of the ceiling, the face of death was peering down. These joys had been final, and their bodies would never know them again. Not that joy of this intensity and the same thought had occurred to them both was ever likely to be re-experienced, even if they should live on to old age. The feel of their fingers intertwined, this too would soon be lost. Even the wood grain patterns they now gazed at on the dark ceiling boards would be taken from them. They could feel death edging in, nearer and nearer. There could be no hesitation now. They must have the courage to reach out to death themselves, and to seize it. "Well, let's make our preparations," said the lieutenant. The note of determination in the words was unmistakable, but at the same time Raiko had never heard her husband's voice so warm and tender. After they had risen, a variety of tasks awaited them. The lieutenant, who had never once before helped with the bedding, now cheerfully slid back the door of the closet, lifted the mattress across the room by himself, and stowed it away inside. Raiko turned off the gas heater and put away the lamp standard. During the lieutenant's absence she had arranged this room carefully, sweeping and dusting it to a fresh cleanness, and now, if one overlooked the rosewood table drawn into one corner, the mat room gave all the appearance of a reception room ready to welcome an important guest. "We've seen some drinking here, haven't we? With Kano and Homa and Noguchi." "Yes, they were great drinkers, all of them. We'll be meeting them before long, in the other world. They'll tease us, I imagine, when they find I've brought you with me." Descending the stairs, the lieutenant turned to look back into this calm, clean room, now brightly illuminated by the ceiling lamp. There floated across his mind the faces of the young officers who had drunk there, and laughed, and innocently bragged. He had never dreamed then that he would one day cut open his stomach in this room. In the 2 rooms downstairs husband and wife busied themselves smoothly and serenely with their respective preparations. The lieutenant went to the toilet, and then to the bathroom to wash. Meanwhile Raiko folded away her husband's padded robe, placed his uniform tunic, his trousers, and a newly cut bleached loincloth in the bathroom, and set out sheets of paper on the living room table for the farewell notes. Then she removed the lid from the writing box and began rubbing ink from the ink tablet. She had already decided upon the wording of her own note. Raiko's fingers pressed hard upon the cold gilt letters of the ink tablet, and the water in the shallow well at once darkened, as if a black cloud had spread across it. She stopped thinking that this repeated action, this pressure from her fingers, this rise and fall of faint sound, was all and solely for death. It was a routine domestic task, a simple paring away of time until death should finally stand before her. But somehow, in the increasingly smooth motion of the tablet rubbing on the stone, and in the scent from the thickening ink, there was unspeakable darkness. Neat in his uniform, which he now wore next to his skin, the lieutenant emerged from the bathroom. Without a word he seated himself at the table, bolt upright, took a brush in his hand, and stared undecidedly at the paper before him. Raiko took a white silk kimono with her and entered the bathroom. When she reappeared in the living room, clad in the white kimono and with her face lightly made up, the farewell note lay completed on the table beneath the lamp. The thick black brush strokes said simply, "Long live the Imperial Forces, Army Lieutenant Takeyama Shinji." While Raiko sat opposite him writing her own note, the lieutenant gazed in silence, intensely serious, at the controlled movement of his wife's pale fingers as they manipulated the brush. With their respective notes in their hands, the lieutenant's sword strapped to his side, Raiko's small dagger thrust into the sash of her white kimono, the two of them stood before the god shelf and silently prayed. Then they put out all the downstairs lights. As he mounted the stairs, the lieutenant turned his head and gazed back at the striking, white-clad figure of his wife, climbing behind him, with lowered eyes. From the darkness beneath, the farewell notes were laid side by side in the alcove of the upstairs room. They wondered whether they ought not to remove the hanging scroll, but since it had been written by their go-between, Lieutenant General Ozeki, and consisted, moreover, of 2 Chinese characters signifying sincerity, they left it where it was, even if it were to become stained with splashes of blood. They felt that the Lieutenant General would understand. The lieutenant, sitting erect with his back to the alcove, laid his sword on the floor before him. Raiko sat facing him, a mat's width away. With the rest of her so severely white, the touch of rouge on her lips seemed remarkably seductive. Across the dividing mat they gazed intently into each other's eyes. The lieutenant's sword lay before his knees. Seeing it, Raiko recalled their first night and was overwhelmed with sadness. The lieutenant spoke, in a hoarse voice, "As I have no second to help me, I shall cut deep. It may look unpleasant, but please do not panic. Death of any sort is a fearful thing to watch. You must not be discouraged by what you see. Is that all right?" "Yes." Raiko nodded deeply. Looking at the slender white figure of his wife, the lieutenant experienced a bizarre excitement. What he was about to perform was an act in his public capacity as a soldier, something he had never previously shown his wife. It called for a resolution equal to the courage to enter battle. It was a death of no less degree and quality than death in the front line. It was his conduct on the battlefield that he was now to display. Momentarily Eventually the thought led the lieutenant to a strange fantasy, a lonely death on the battlefield, a death beneath the eyes of his beautiful wife, and the sensation that he was now to die in these two dimensions. Realizing an impossible union of them both, there was sweetness beyond words. This must be the very pinnacle of good fortune, he thought. To have every moment of his death observed by those beautiful eyes, it was like being born to death on a gentle, fragrant breeze. There was some special favor here. He did not understand precisely what it was, but it was a domain unknown to others. A dispensation granted to no one else had been permitted to himself. In the radiant, bride-like figure of his white robe twice, the lieutenant seemed to see a vision of all those things he had loved and for which he was to lay down his life. The imperial household, the nation, the army flag, all these, no less than the wife who sat before him, were presences observing him closely with clear and never faltering eyes. Raiko too was gazing intently at her husband, so soon to die, and she thought that never in this world had she seen anything so beautiful. The lieutenant always looked well in uniform, but now, as he contemplated death with severe brows and firmly closed lips, he revealed what was perhaps masculine beauty at its most superb. "It's time to go," the lieutenant said at last. Raiko bent her body low to the mat in a deep bow. She could not raise her face. She did not wish to spoil her makeup with tears, but the tears could not be held back. When at length she looked up, she saw hazily through the tears that her husband had wound a white bandage around the blade of his now unsheathed sword, leaving 5 or 6 inches of naked steel showing at the point, resting the sword in its cloth. Resting the sword in its cloth wrapping on the mat before him, the lieutenant rose from his knees, resettled himself cross-legged, and unfastened the hooks of his uniform collar. His eyes no longer saw his wife. Slowly, one by one, he undid the flat brass buttons. The dusky brown chest was revealed, and then the stomach. He unclasped his belt and undid the buttons of his trousers. The pure whiteness of the thickly coiled loincloth showed itself. The lieutenant pushed the cloth down with both hands, further to ease his stomach, and then reached for the white bandaged blade of his sword. With his left hand he massaged his abdomen, glancing downward as he did so. To reassure himself on the sharpness of his sword's cutting edge, the lieutenant folded back the left trouser flap, exposing a little of his thigh, and lightly drew the blade across the skin. Blood welled up in the wound at once, and several streaks of red trickled downward, glistening in the strong light. It was the first time Raiko had ever seen her husband's blood, and she felt a violent throbbing in her chest. She looked at her husband's face. The lieutenant was looking at the blood with calm appraisal, for a moment though thinking at the same time that it was hollow comfort. Raiko experienced a sense of relief. The lieutenant's eyes fixed his wife with an intense, hawk-like stare, moving the sword around to his front. He raised himself slightly on his hips and let the upper half of his body lean over the sword point. That he was mustering his whole strength was apparent from the angry tension of the uniform at his shoulders. The lieutenant aimed to strike deep into the left of his stomach. His sharp cry pierced the silence of the room. Despite the effort he had himself put into the blow, the lieutenant had the impression that someone else had struck the side of his stomach agonizingly with a thick rod of iron. For a second or so his head reeled and he had no idea what had happened. The 5 or 6 inches of naked point had vanished completely into his flesh, and the white bandage, gripped in his clenched fist, pressed directly against his stomach. He returned to consciousness. The blade had certainly pierced the wall of the stomach.
Listening to a short story for English.
His breathing was difficult. His chest thumped violently, and in some far deep region, which he could hardly believe was a part of himself, a fearful and excruciating pain came welling up as if the veins had split open to disgorge a boiling stream of molten rock. The pain came suddenly nearer, with terrifying speed. The lieutenant bit his lower lip and stifled an instinctive moan. Was this seppuku? He was thinking.
Yeah.
It was a sensation of utter chaos, as if the sky had fallen on his head and the world was reeling drunkenly. His willpower and courage, which had seemed so robust before he made the incision, had now dwindled to something like a single hair-like thread of steel, and he was assailed by the uneasy feeling that he must advance along this thread, clinging to it with desperation. His clenched fist had grown moist. Looking down, he saw that both his hand and the cloth about the blade were drenched in blood. His loincloth too was dyed a deep red. It struck him as incredible that, amidst this terrible agony, things which could be seen could still be seen, and existing things existed still. The moment the lieutenant thrust the sword into his left side and she saw the deathly pallor fall across his face, like an abruptly lowered curtain, Raiko had to struggle to prevent herself from rushing to his side. Whatever happened, she must watch. She must be a witness. That was the duty her husband had laid upon her. Opposite her, a match space away, she could clearly see her husband biting his lip to stifle the pain. The pain was there, with absolute certainty, before her eyes, and Raiko had no means of rescuing him from it. The sweat glistened on her husband's forehead. The lieutenant closed his eyes, and then opened them again, as if experimenting. The eyes had lost their luster, and seemed innocent and empty like the eyes of a small animal. The agony before Raiko's eyes burned as strong as the summer sun, utterly remote from the grief which seemed to be tearing herself apart within. The pain grew steadily in stature, stretching upward. Raiko felt that her husband had already become a man in a separate world, a man whose whole being had been resolved into pain, a prisoner in a cage of pain where no hand could reach out to him. But Raiko felt no pain
One
at all.
sparkling,
Her
one
grief was
normal.
not pain. As she thought about this, Raiko began to feel as if someone had raised a cruel glass line between herself and her husband. Ever since her marriage, her husband's existence had been one of existence, and every moment was had to talk about herself. But now, while her husband's existence in pain was a
stopping at
reality,
HEB for
Raiko could
sushi.
find in this grief with hers no certain proof at all of her own existence. With only his right hand on the sword, the lieutenant began to cut sideways across his stomach. But as the blade became entangled with the entrails, it was pushed constantly outward by their soft resilience, and the lieutenant realized that it would be necessary, as he caught, to use both hands to keep the point pressed deep into his stomach. He pulled the blade across. It did not cut as easily as he had expected. He directed the strength of his whole body into his right hand and pulled again. There was a cut of 3 or 4 inches. The pain spread slowly outward from the inner depths until the whole stomach reverberated. It was like the wild clanging of a bell, or like 1,000 bells which jangled simultaneously at every breath he breathed and every throb of his pulse, rocking his whole being. The lieutenant could no longer stop himself from moaning, but by now the blade had cut its way through to below the navel, and when he noticed this he felt a sense of satisfaction, and a renewal of courage. The volume of blood had steadily increased, and now it spurted from the wound as if propelled by the beat of the pulse. The mat before the...
He's trying to turn on the speaker.
Probably.
Want me to turn it up?
Play.
No,
Josh Groban.
It's not on yet.
What kind of recording is that? It sounds like an automatic one.
I'm having Siri read it to me.
Oh, Let me get the mail. You got some from Auburn. Some of the scholarship information.
No.
Oh.
It's almost over.
As if propelled by the beat of the pulse, the mat before the lieutenant was drenched red with splattered blood, and more blood overflowed onto it from pools which gathered in the folds of the lieutenant's khaki trousers. A spot, like a bird, came flying across to Raiko and settled on the lap of her white silk kimono. By the time the lieutenant had at last drawn the sword across to the right side of his stomach, the blade was already cutting shallow and had revealed its naked tip, slippery with blood and grease. But, suddenly stricken by a fit of vomiting, the lieutenant cried out hoarsely. The vomiting made the fierce pain fiercer still, and the stomach, which had thus far remained firm and compact, now abruptly heaved, opening wide its wound, and the entrails burst through, as if the wound too were vomiting. Seemingly ignorant of their master's suffering, the entrails gave an impression of robust health and almost disagreeable vitality as they slipped smoothly out and spilled over into the crotch. The lieutenant's head drooped, his shoulders heaved, his eyes opened to narrow slits, and a thin trickle of saliva dribbled from his mouth. The gold markings on his epaulets caught the light and glinted. Blood was scattered everywhere. The lieutenant was soaked in it to his knees, and he sat now in a crumpled and listless posture, one hand on the floor. A raw smell filled the room. The lieutenant, his head drooping, retched repeatedly, and the movement showed vividly in his shoulders. The blade of the sword, now pushed back by the entrails and exposed to its tip, was still in the lieutenant's right hand. It would be difficult to imagine a more heroic sight than that of the lieutenant at this moment, as he mustered his strength and flung back his head. The movement was performed with sudden violence, and the back of his head struck with a sharp crack against the alcove pillar. Raiko had been sitting until now with her face lowered, gazing in fascination at the tide of blood advancing toward her knees. But the sound took her by surprise and she looked up. The lieutenant's face was not the face of a living man. The eyes were hollow, the skin parched, the once so lustrous cheeks and lips the color of dried mud. The right hand alone was moving, laboriously gripping the sword. It hovered shakily in the air like the hand of a marionette and strove to direct the point at the base of the lieutenant's throat. Raiko watched her husband make this last, most heartrending, futile exertion, glistening with blood and grease. The point was thrust at the throat again and again, and each time it missed its aim. The strength to guide it was no longer there. The straying point struck the collar and the collar badges, although its hooks had been unfastened. The stiff military collar had closed together again and was protecting the throat. Raiko could bear the sight no longer. She tried to go to her husband's help, but she could not stand. She moved through the blood on her knees, and her white skirts grew deep red. Moving to the rear of her husband, she helped no more than by loosening the collar. The quivering blade at last contacted the naked flesh of the throat. At that moment Raiko's impression was that she herself had propelled her husband forward, but that was not the case. It was a movement planned by the lieutenant himself, his last exertion of strength. Abruptly he threw his body at the blade, and the blade pierced his neck, emerging at the nape. There was a tremendous spurt of blood and the lieutenant lay still, cold gritting steel protruding from his neck at the back. Slowly, her socks slippery with blood, Raiko descended the stairway. The upstairs room was now completely still. Switching on the ground floor lights, she checked the gas jet and the main gas plug and poured water over the smoldering, half-buried charcoal in the brazier. She stood before the upright mirror in the 4.5 mat room and held up her skirts. The bloodstains made it seem as if a bold, vivid pattern was printed across the lower half of her white kimono. When she sat down before the mirror, she was conscious of the dampness and coldness of her husband's blood in the region of her thighs, and she shivered. Then, for a long while, she lingered over her toilet preparations. She applied the rouge generously to her cheeks, and her lips too she painted heavily. This was no longer makeup to please her husband. It was makeup for the world which she would leave behind, and there was a touch of the magnificent and the spectacular in her brushwork. When she rose, the mat before the mirror was wet with blood. Raiko was not concerned about this. Returning from the toilet, Raiko stood finally on the cement floor of the porchway. When her husband had bolted the door here last night it had been in preparation for death. For a while she stood immersed in the consideration of a simple problem. Should she now leave the bolt drawn? If she were to lock the door, it could be that the neighbors might not notice their suicide for several days. Raiko did not relish the thought of their two corpses putrefying before discovery. After all, it seemed, it would be best to leave it open. She released the bolt, and also drew open the frosted glass door a fraction. At once a chill wind blew in. There was no sign of anyone in the midnight streets, and stars glittered ice cold through the trees in the large house opposite. Leaving the door as it was, Raiko mounted the stairs. She had walked here and there for some time and her socks were no longer slippery. About halfway up, her nostrils were already assailed by a peculiar smell. The lieutenant was lying on his face in a sea of blood. The point protruding from his neck seemed to have grown even more prominent than before. Raiko walked heedlessly across the blood. Sitting beside the lieutenant's corpse, she stared intently at the face, which lay on one cheek on the mat. The eyes were opened wide, as if the lieutenant's attention had been attracted by something. She raised the head, folding it in her sleeve, wiped the blood from the lips, and bestowed a last kiss. Then she rose and took from the closet a new white blanket and a waist cord. To prevent any derangement of her skirts, she wrapped the blanket about her waist and bound it there firmly with the cord. Raiko sat herself on a spot about 1 foot distant from the lieutenant's body. Drawing the dagger from her sash, she examined its dully gleaming blade intently, and held it to her tongue. The taste of the polished steel was slightly sweet. Raiko did not linger. When she thought how the pain which had previously opened such a gulf between herself and her dying husband was now to become a part of her own experience, she saw before her only the joy of herself entering the realm her husband had already made his own. In her husband's agonized face there had been something inexplicable which she was seeing for the first time. Now she would solve that riddle. Raiko sensed that at last she too would be able to taste the true bitterness and sweetness of that great moral principle in which her husband believed. What had until now been tasted only faintly through her husband's example she was about to savor directly with her own tongue. Raiko rested the point of the blade against the base of her throat. She thrust hard. The wound was only shallow. Her head laced, and her hands shook uncontrollably. She gave the blade a strong pull sideways. A warm substance fluttered into her mouth, and everything before her eyes reddened. In a vision of spouting blood, she gathered her strength and plunged the point of the blade deep into her throat.
That's it.
She killed herself?
Yep.
What was that?
Patriotism.